Okay, good morning to everyone. Go ahead and turn over to 1 Kings chapter 19. I anticipate we will finally finish chapter 19. I've only got a few verses left, so hopefully we will do that. Just a quick recap of where we are as far as our study of the life and times of Elijah and Elisha. Elijah, even after the whole just awesome signs that were seen on Mount Carmel, he is fleeing for his life from Queen Jezebel. She's made it very clear her intentions are still to kill him, and she's going to make it happen one way or the other. And so he flees, and he goes south this time, out of Israel through Judah to Beersheba, which is the most kind of southern tip border city, if you will, of the southern kingdom of Judah. He leaves his servant there, the servant who had been with him at least since Mount Carmel. We're not given a lot of information about that person otherwise. But he leaves him here, and so Elijah goes out a day's journey all by himself. He kind of cries out to God, saying, this is futile. I'm no better. Nothing good has come of this. God sends an angel. The angel restores him with some bread and some water, which might have been some really good bread, because then he goes 40 days, probably with no other sustenance, to Mount Horeb, which we also call Sinai. And there he has a very interesting conversation and experience with God, not too unlike Moses' experience having God's presence pass before him. Elijah has a very similar, there are some differences, but the fact that the presence of God passed before him is a very interesting parallel at the same place, as a matter of fact, at that mountain. So Elijah, he's still kind of saying, this is the end, why am I going on? Just let me die. And the end of what we went through last week was God saying, no, you've still got work to do, and I've got some assignments for you. I want to just mention those real quick. He wanted to have Elijah anoint Hazael, king of Aram. This is not something that we see happen. It doesn't mean it didn't. And then later, of course, Elisha will confirm to Hazael that he is becoming king, although I don't think he anoints him in that passage, if I remember correctly. We're going to probably talk about that a little bit more when we get into chapter 20. He also tells Elijah to anoint Jehu king over Israel. This is not the same Jehu who was a prophet mentioned back in chapter 16. We don't have any record of Elijah doing this. We do see Elisha sending a prophet to anoint Jehu later on in 2 Kings chapter 9. So it may have been that Elijah passed down that job or did it, and then he was anointed again by Elisha, or the prophet that Elisha sent. I'm going to do that a lot. It's not exactly clear. But then the last one was to anoint Elisha to succeed Elijah as prophet. This one we're going to read about just a second here. That's exactly what happens next. So I'm not going to spoil any of that. So that's where we are as far as that goes. Those are the instructions he's given, and he's going to do at least one of them here. We're about to see at the end of chapter 19. Any things that we should mention before we get into chapter 19, verse 19? Jeff, go ahead.
So Elijah, when he comes to out in the wilderness, obviously he's depressed.
Well, yeah.
That's about as much depression as you could possibly have. You want to die. So God kind of gives us the secret to overcoming our down times, our low moments in life, whether it be depression or not quite that bad. And that's to get busy doing good things. So God cares about Elijah, and he doesn't want Elijah to remain this way. It takes time sometimes for our receive our reward. And so, something for us to think about. There's always something we can do to make somebody's life a little better. And in doing that, we'll make our own better.
Yeah, and it's not like God is just giving Elijah some busy work here to keep Elijah just busy for the sake of being busy, because there are a lot of things you can do to do that. But he's setting the foundations for things that are to come. I mean, we're going to talk a lot about Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha. They're going to be three very prominent people in 2 Kings. Not yet, but they will be. So God is having Elisha kind of setting the groundwork for what's to come. And I mean, we've probably heard feelings like this from older Christians. Like, maybe you've got a widow or a widower, their spouse has gone on, and they're like wondering, why does God still have me here? I don't feel like I'm doing anything or I'm contributing in any way. And sometimes maybe it's not for us. Maybe we're here for someone else to help lay that groundwork for what will come later. And we don't always see that. We don't have the insight that God has. But we need to recognize he doesn't just have us here to just keep busy for the sake of being busy. We have things to do. God makes it very clear to Elijah in this, because he pretty much tells him, you need to do these things. And, those who escape from Hazael, Jehu's going to take care of, and those who escape from him, Elisha's going to take care of. So I think Elijah kind of understands very clearly what God is trying to do here. We don't necessarily get that. We don't get God coming in his presence and, showing us all these amazing things and saying, I want you to do this very specific thing. But that doesn't mean there are very specific things that, we can do. Or something along those lines. So something definitely for us to think about. Any other comments before we move on here? Okay. All right. Let's get someone to read for us 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 19 through 21, please.
So he departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he was with the 12. Then Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle on him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, Please let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you. And he said to him, Go back again, for what have I done to you? So Elisha turned back from him and took a yoke of oxen and slaughtered them, boiled their flesh using the oxen's equipment, and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and followed Elijah and became his servant.
Okay. So just 3 verses here, but there's a lot we can get out of these 3 verses. I like these. It's very compact, but there's a lot of information that we can get, even if it's not maybe the most important information. It really paints a picture for us about this interaction and really about Elisha. This is kind of our first real introduction to Elisha. Of course, he was mentioned earlier in this chapter as one of the tasks that Elijah's supposed to do, but we don't know anything about this Elisha guy except for who his dad is, and that was it. That was all that was mentioned. But here we get actually quite a bit of information about him in this, just few verses here at the end of chapter 19. So according to, I guess we knew where he lived, because back in verse 16 that we read last week, it was said he was in Abel Meholah. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. You're just going to have to go with me on that. Now, this exact location is not exactly agreed upon by scholars. The best thing they can agree on is it's probably in the northern kingdom of Israel somewhere in the Jordan Valley, somewhere on the west side of the Jordan River. But like exactly where in that, you're going to see little small differences. But basically, if you triangulate Jezreel and Tirzah, and you go, I'm going to try to mirror it so it'll be free. If you go east, right before the Jordan River, it's somewhere in that area. That's where most of your maps will put it. It's a little bit disputed because they're not exactly sure, but it's somewhere in that area there. So we know where he lives, so that's helpful. We know who his father is. That was mentioned earlier, and then again here in this section of verses. His father was Shaphat. Now, there are actually different men by this name. It's another case where we have multiple people who have the same name, and so we have to differentiate, who's who. He doesn't seem to be really any of the other guys mentioned. There are a few that are mentioned in, I think there's one in Numbers and some in Chronicles. Not the same guy, though. As far as I can tell, the time doesn't match up. I don't think it could be the same guy. So he's just known as the father of Elisha, basically. We don't really have any other information about him as far as I understand. But it's just an identifier about who this Elisha is. He's the son of this guy, Shaphat. But Shaphat himself, we don't know anything except for his connection to Elisha. So nothing really fun to talk about there. Now, Elisha at this point, we need to talk about him directly now. He is not a prophet by trade. Now, this is not an uncommon thing where God calls someone to, prophesy or to go on a, certain directive or mission who is not a prophet. Amos was that way, famously. The prophet Amos, he was a shepherd and a keeper of fig trees, I think it was. But he's called to go and prophesy to the northern kingdom of Israel, even though he was from the south. But he was not a prophet by trade. Elisha clearly here is not a prophet by trade, because when Elijah goes to see him, what is Elisha doing? He's working a field. You're not going to see prophets doing that very often. And some of the details here about this are pretty interesting, and we may make a few assumptions here, but I think they're too difficult to make. I'm going to assume the land he's plowing is his own land, just because it seems the oxen he has are his own oxen, given what he does to them later. I don't think he would do that to someone else's oxen. But he's also driving 12 yoke of oxen. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever worked with oxen in a field. Working with one yoke of oxen is plenty hard enough. He's driving 12, which is 24 oxen at the same time. And the description he uses, the wording can be kind of strange, but I think the way we're supposed to read it is he's got 12 yoke of oxen, and then he's in the back with the 12th pair, and he's driving them with it, which I think is probably a really incredible thing to do. I think that takes quite a bit of skill and strength. I'm trying to imagine how that would work, because that seems to be way too many oxen. He must have a really big field. I'm not sure how that is, but he's hard at work. He is not, sitting around. He's not meditating. He's not. He's at work right now. He's definitely doing a lot of work. And from the description we get of this, he is a man of some means. Now, I don't think he's rich, because he's doing the work himself. If he was rich, someone else would be doing it, unless he just really likes the work for fun. But I'm going to guess, he's probably not super rich. But he's got land, and he's got 12 yoke of oxen, so he's not a poor man either. So we could probably guess he's somewhere in the middle class of Israel. I don't know what the GDP of Israel was at that time. I didn't go into that. That would have been a whole thing. But he is not desperate. It's not like, I've got this failing farm. I might as well go fall and do this work for God. But he's living on his own. He's got his own means of sustenance and making a living. So he is a farmer by trade. I think that's a pretty good way of looking at it. Probably not too dissimilar to Amos's condition, I imagine. Anyway, so we get all this kind of really interesting trappings about Elisha that kind of paint us a picture about who he was. He's probably not, we don't hear of a wife that I know of. I don't think he has any kids. But he also doesn't seem to be an extremely young person, because he seems to be taking on a lot of this work himself. I doubt he's in his teens. I would guess at least 20s at the youngest. But he's definitely capable of taking care of himself at this point. So that's what we know about him. So let's talk about the interaction here between Elijah and Elisha. And if I ever slip up and accidentally say the wrong one, I hope you're all going to understand. In God's infinite wisdom, he put these two people together in this part of the Bible, and they're constantly interacting. So I'll try to do my best not to missay. So Elijah, he finds Elisha, and it talks about him throwing his cloak over him. And it seems to be, I imagine Elisha's hard at work. He's not really paying attention to anything that's going on. He's working these oxen. He's in the zone. He's doing his job. And suddenly this guy comes up and throws a cloak over him. Now, the first thing I would think about, I guess, if I was that farmer, would be like, what are you doing? Like, I'm busy. Don't bother me. But I think we need to talk about this particular action and maybe what it signifies. I looked at a few, resources and, commentaries about this, and a lot of them seem to talk about that this is a sign of investiture or adoption, like as one is adopting a son. To throw your cloak over someone is to be like, you're going to be with me, I'm going to be over you kind of thing. We're connected in some way. You'll see commentaries talk about that. I don't have anything else to go off of about that. And, it sounds pretty good because when you look at Elisha's reaction, he doesn't get mad and say, "Oh man, what are you doing? I'm busy." He goes after him. And so that's a really interesting thing. So he seems to understand this sign, what Elijah's doing, because it seems like Elijah put his cloak on him and then kind of moved off, and Elisha had to go on after him. Maybe he had to get the oxen to stop first, after he realized what was happening. I'm not exactly sure. We don't get a lot of details in that. But he had to go and get him and talk to him about basically what this was. I think, Jeff, did you have your hand up? I'll get back to you real quick.
The mantle for Elijah and turn Elisha later is almost like Moses' staff.
Yeah, in a way.
It will kind of represent the authority, and he'll use it in wielding power in certain circumstances from God. And just kind of an interesting thing. It's kind of an object that is used to represent something.
Yeah, I hadn't made that connection, but his cloak does come into play later on too. So yeah, there's another interesting parallel with Moses there. I hadn't even thought of that one. So chalk 1 point up to Jeff, I guess. So. Very good. We have and I'm going to compare this with another verse here in the Bible. We'll talk about this situation first. So Elisha, he wants to join Elijah. He seems to understand Elijah's throwing the cloak over him, what this means, what this signifies, that Elijah is in a way adopting him into his service, and he seems all for it, but he has one request, and it's in verse 20. He asks him, let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I'll come and I'll join you. So that's really interesting. And Elijah says, okay. He says, this is fine. Go ahead and do this. Go ahead. And then when when Elisha, I know it was going to happen. When Elisha gets the okay from Elijah, he goes back and he does a little bit more than just that. I'm sure he did do that. I'm sure he did say his goodbyes. But he also slaughters all the oxen. He burns the plowing equipment to cook the meat. Then he gives the meat away to the people, which in a way seems like, why would he be doing this? It seems like a weird thing to do. But I think this is Elijah, either to himself or to Elijah, or maybe for the people who are there witnessing it, letting them know that he's going and he's not coming back to this. If I was a farmer and I was called to do something, and if I ever thought I was going to come back, I wouldn't be slaughtering my oxen. I wouldn't be burning my plowing equipment, because I'm going to need that later. That's how I make my living. But Elisha seems to be, what we might call burning our bridges. Sometimes that's, or burning the boats. That's sometimes seen as a bad, negative thing. But he's saying, no, I'm not coming back to this life. I'm going to follow Elijah the prophet, and that's the life I'm going to have from here on out. 100% full stop. Even if I wanted to come back, there'd be nothing for me to come back to, kind of thing. He's really trying to, and I'm not sure exactly who it's for, but this is what we get from his actions is he's going to go with Elijah, he's not coming back, and he's all in, if you will. Now, I want to compare this a little bit to, go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 9, and we'll talk about, I want to get your all's opinion on this, because my mind is still not quite wrapped around it. Luke chapter 9, I'm going to read verses, let me see if I find it here, 61 and 62. This is a situation where people are asking to, follow Jesus, and, people have these conditions, let me do this first, let me do that, let me bury my father, and then Jesus has certain replies that seem like kind of like negative replies about this. We get to the last one here. Luke chapter 9, verse 61, 62 says, "Still another said, 'I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family.' Jesus replied, 'No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God.'" So there's two interesting things here. A plow is mentioned. I don't think that's really the strong connection. But he asked almost the same thing that Elisha asks of Elijah. to first let me go and say goodbye to my family. It's pretty much the exact same situation as far as that goes. And Elijah doesn't seem to give him too much grief about it. He lets him go back. Elisha does all the stuff he does, and then he does, and he joins Elijah. But Jesus here says something that's kind of different. He says, and again, he's speaking a little bit metaphorically, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the service in the kingdom of God, sort of implying in sort of a negative way to this person that, if you want to do my service, but you want to do something else first, your priority is wrong, and you're not fit to do this kind of work. So how can we look at what Jesus says here in Luke 9, comparing it to what Elijah says back here in 1 Kings 19, and say that these are both fine, when they seem to be almost contradictory in their responses? Any thoughts on that? Jeff? Go ahead.
Mine says too that he said, "For what have I done today?" So he wasn't so happy.
Well, and that is a weird wording of it, and I think, and this is kind of my thought along with some commentaries, that Elijah was not trying to be in his way or force him to do this. This was Elisha's free will. I'm not forcing you to do this, but then he kind of lets Elisha go and do it. He doesn't seem to have any ill will toward Elisha at that point or later, never brings it up. And he does join him. So, it's a little bit interesting. Jeff, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
I'm not sure Jesus is telling this person who says he wants to go and bid the people at his house farewell that he can't do that. I think he's taking the occasion to say, look, in whatever you decide to do, you've got to put your past life behind you. Saying goodbye to your parents, and Elisha wants to kiss his parents goodbye, it's not necessarily clinging to the past, in my understanding. You can do that. You can say, I'll be back when I can, to your parents or something like that. And that's not what God wants. God does want us to revisit our own life from time to time, or have sentimental feelings about our old life. The people at my home, the people that my parents, in the case of Luke, represents the past, my past life, and all that's associated with it. Abraham did not go back. He sent his servant back for Isaac to find a wife, but Abraham did not go back. And he could have gone back. And so I'm not saying, I'm not sure that Jesus is saying it's wrong to tell your loved ones goodbye, but you need to make sure you understand that when you serve Christ, you don't go back to your old way of life ever.
And as far as the familial connection here, I think Luke chapter 12 would agree with that. When Luke, it's like 53, those verses around there, where Jesus is talking about how families are going to be divided here. Father against son, mother against daughter, so on and so forth. Jesus is, in a way, is saying, your service to me is more important than even these familial connections. Now, in the Jewish society, family is a big deal. I mean, it's still a big deal today. I think even more so, though, in those times, in that culture, family is everything. And if you say, well, I'm going to do whatever my father does or whatever my mother chooses to do, that's what I'll do too, and Jesus is calling you to something else, then it's not going to work. You've got to put God and service to God before that. So that's certainly one way we can look at that. Arnold, go ahead.
Yeah, I believe Elisha, he definitely understood that the significance of what had just happened to him. So, but he also understood that, okay, I'm going to do this. He basically seems like he didn't have any choice, but he knew he didn't have any choice. But he wanted to, I guess, honor his mother and father.
I think he probably had a choice.
Yeah, he did, but he wanted to go back and bid goodbye, not just they'd be looking for him. Say, what happened?
Yeah.
So he kind of wanted to go back. And the other thing is Jesus, he used this, I believe, as a reminder that once you put your hands, if we're driving down the field,
Yeah, and in a way, Elisha does that because he gets rid of everything that he could go back to. So he's definitely not going back. Yeah, and he definitely shows that. Yeah, these are all good thoughts. One other thought I had, maybe, and you know, we're about to do a Hebrew study here, not too long. I don't want to step on too many toes, but one of the big things about Hebrews is talking about the superiority of Christ. And I don't know if this is necessarily something to pull from this. It's just a thought. You know, Elijah is saying to Elisha, yeah, go ahead and, you know, say your goodbyes and then we'll move on. And Jesus is saying, you know, no, like this is more important. And I don't know if that's necessarily the way to be taken. The context may be a little different here. But in a way, I could almost see that by Jesus saying this, he's saying my work is more important than Elijah's work if you were comparing the two. I don't know if this is supposed to be a comparison, but it's an interesting parallel. And throughout pretty much the first half of Hebrews, maybe not half, but around that, first part of Hebrews, is the Hebrew writer just outlining all of the superior things about Christ. Superior to angels, superior to Moses, superior to Abraham. Superior to Elijah would not be a step far removed from that. I think with all the parallels we have with Elijah and Moses, and of course we'll see more of those, I think that would not be a far step to make. I don't know if that's the point Jesus is making here, but I think it's an interesting thought. Just throwing that out there. I'm not trying to push that. It's just something I thought about. I didn't see any commentary that had the same idea, but I don't agree with commentaries all the time, so that's fine. Any other thoughts on that?
I think also, this is Elijah, and maybe Elijah didn't want to make a law that Jesus is willing to make. I think this is just different. Elijah says, you know, what's his statement? For what have I done to you? I don't want to be the cause of you not ever seeing your parents again one more time. But you think about this concept of looking back. When you're plowing a field, plowing takes a great deal of skill to be done right. And if you look back, there's a couple of things that happen. First of all, you're liable to usually, and I don't know if you've done this in driving, when you look around this way, you tend to turn the wheel a little bit that way. When you look around to the left, you turn the wheel a little bit to the left. And that's just human nature. So you're going to mess up if you're looking back all the time. But secondly, when you look back, even if you don't mess up, maybe you're really skilled and you're plowing good, straight furrows. You admire that. And that's a mighty fine field you plowed. It took a lot of skill to do that. You're feeling pretty good about yourself. But you know, the truth of the matter is you're going to put seeds in the ground. It's going to all be covered up. And then next year you got to plow it again. So you can't get too excited about every little thing you do right in life. You'll inflate yourself unrealistically. And each day is a day unto itself. And so just because you did something good last week doesn't mean you're a great person. You have to keep on doing the right thing in your life. And so looking back is not a wise thing to do.
Yeah, and Jesus here in Luke 9 is using something that people would easily understand. Like, because farming was such a huge part of the culture, if you're plowing, you're looking back, you're not paying attention to what's in front of you. It's easy, you know, when you look back, you might tilt one way or the other. In fact, we tell our kids in Green Power Racing not to do that, not to look around. Check your mirrors, don't look around because you're going to be doing this. And they don't have the skill to not do that. Or you'll see even, you know, Olympic runners, when they're running and they're tight, they're not usually looking at each other and seeing, you know, how close is he. They're all looking forward because they know as soon as they turn their head, they're going to miss the mark. They're going to slow down in some way. That's one of the big things they focus on. So, yeah, definitely is something that was understandable. And again, I don't think these verses are contradictory. I think the context may be a little different. It's just interesting the similarities we have here. So I wanted to bring it up because I'm sure someone would otherwise, because they're just so interestingly similar. So I wanted to bring that up and maybe give us a little time to think about that as well, which is always good to do. I think it's always good to compare these things. Any other thoughts before we close out that chapter and move on? Go ahead, Christian.
One thing, too, I was thinking about looking back is that, you know, and yes, we do know, like, all the Olympic athletes are not going to be looking back and, you know, to really get there. But when you do look back, I mean, if you kind of extrapolate on a little and look, if you go back there, those people are not, they don't have this mission to go with Elijah. And they could, you know, and in real, in our lives, if we don't stay with the church, with the people who go, well, maybe I was better off going with those
And I think similarly, we have Solomon, I think it's toward the end of Ecclesiastes, I can't remember off the top of my head. He talks about, don't say, why are these times worse than past times because such things are unwise. I think it's Ecclesiastes. I might be wrong on that. Somebody can check me on that. But we do that. We get this nostalgia in a way. We see that times are hard now, and then I look back and say, I wouldn't have these hard times when I was in such and such situation way back then. Why can't we go back to that? That could be a whole great talk in itself. I'm not going to get too far into that. But in a way, this is what God is calling us to. Don't think that you put on this new body, this new man, and then you're hoping for the things that you wish you had that was before you were a Christian. Don't do that, because that's not going to get you anywhere. And there are people that do that, and they're like, oh yeah, I became a Christian, but I miss these things that I used to do that I can't do anymore, and they linger on it, and that causes them to get depressed or discouraged in some way, and that can be dangerous if we linger on that. I think maybe another good example, and we'll try to move on here. In Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about Abraham, and that's somebody we talked about somewhat recently in our studies. Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees, went to a totally different place. He never went back, but I believe the Hebrew writer talks about him saying, if he wanted to go back, he could have gone. He had every opportunity to do so, but Abraham was more concerned with fulfilling God's will. He could have turned back. He could have gone back home. Instead, he lived in a strange land. And so that's another interesting example about that. So,
One thing
okay.
to add to that, in Hebrews 11, it says he didn't go back because he was searching for a city not made with hands.
Yeah, he was searching with a city with foundations whose architect and builder is God.
So we have eyes in the front of our head, and we need to keep focused on the future and on the present and our obligations.
Yeah, absolutely. Abraham's a great example for all those kinds of things. So I like that the Hebrew writer provides us those extra details for us. Very good. Let's go ahead and we won't get very far, but we'll start chapter 20. I wanted to at least begin because we're going to see a situation here. And just before we get into this, one thing I do want to mention, Elijah and Elisha are going to kind of take a back seat for a little while in a lot of the events that are going to occur from here on out for a time. He'll come up every once in a while, but won't be like the main focus. The main focus really will be Ahab for a while, and his interactions with Ben-Hadad, but mostly Ahab. So Elijah and Elisha, they're around, they're doing things, but they're not directly in these stories for a while. In fact, Elisha will probably not, it really won't be talked about for a while. He'll kind of be in the background. He's with Elijah. We know that because the end of this chapter tells us that, but he won't always be named. But when Elijah's there by name, you'll know, okay, probably Elisha's there with him. We have no reason to doubt that otherwise. So he's there. He's just maybe not always mentioned. And we're going to see other prophets kind of take their turns talking to Ahab and interacting with him. And a lot of times they're not named. It'll just say a prophet of God or a man of God will do this or that. There's some that will suppose that maybe this is Elijah doing this. He's just not named Elijah. I don't tend to think that, just because a lot of the times when we get details about it, Ahab's interactions with these unnamed prophets are different than when we know for sure it's Ahab and Elijah. Ahab and Elijah have a very interesting relationship, if you will. They speak to each other in very certain ways that makes it really obvious that it's them. And then when you see Ahab talking to these unnamed prophets, the dialogue is not that way. So I tend to think that it's not Elijah. You will probably see commentaries suppose that it might be. I don't think so. This will also add credence to God saying to Elijah on Mount Horeb, I've got 7,000 people who have not bowed to Baal. It gives more credence to Obadiah, who hid 100 prophets in caves that he talks about. These might be some of those prophets. We get companies of prophets that are mentioned here and there. They're not given any names, but it's a group of men who are prophets. And these unnamed prophets might be part of one of those groups. So don't think that every time a prophet comes up, it's Elijah, because I don't think it is. And I don't necessarily have the best way to prove that. It just makes more sense to say when it's Elijah, it's Elijah. When it doesn't say it's Elijah, it's probably not Elijah. If I come to a case where I think that may be different, I'll let you know, but that's how I'm going to interpret it from here on out. So when we see an unnamed prophet of God, I'm not assuming that's Elijah. Just it's a prophet of God. We just don't know his name. Anyway, just want to lay that groundwork there for a second. Let's have someone read for us 1 Kings chapter 20, verses 1 through 12, please. 1 through 12.
Now Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, gathered all his forces together. 32 kings were with him, with horses and chariots. And he went up and besieged Samaria and made war against it. Then he sent messengers into the city to Ahab, king of Israel, and said to him, Thus says Ben-Hadad, your silver and your gold are mine, your loveliest wives and children are mine. And the king of Israel answered and said, My lord, O king, just as you say, I and all that I have are yours. Then the messengers came back and said, Thus speaks Ben-Hadad, saying, Indeed, I have sent to you, saying, You shall deliver to me your silver and your gold, your wives and your children. But I will send my servants to you tomorrow about this time, and they shall search your house and the houses of your servants. And it shall be that whatever is pleasant in your eyes, they will put in their hands and take it. So the king of Israel called all the elders of the land and said, Notice, please, and see how this man seeks trouble. For he sent to me for my wives, my children, my silver, and my gold, and I did not deny him. And all the elders and all the people said to him, Do not listen or consent. Therefore he said to the messengers of Ben-Hadad, Tell my lord the king, all that you sent for to your servant the first time I will do, but this thing I cannot do. And the messengers departed and brought back word to him. Then Ben-Hadad sent to him and said, The gods do so to me, and more also, if enough dust is left of Samaria for a handful for each of the people who follow me. So the king of Israel answered and said, Tell him, let not the one who puts on his armor boast like the one who takes it off. And it happened when Ben-Hadad heard this message, as he and the kings were drinking at the command post, that he said to his servants, Get ready. And they got ready to attack the city.
Okay. These are some of the most fun dialogues to go through. We're going to have a lot of fun with chapter 20. Like I said, we're not going to finish. We're just going to start a little bit. So remember back to chapter 19, Elijah had been given instructions by God to anoint Hazael king over Aram. Even if that has happened, he is not yet the king. You can think back to another parallel when Samuel anoints David as king over Israel. That doesn't happen for a long time because Saul is still king of Israel at the time. So that's kind of a similar situation. Ben-Hadad is currently the king of Aram. Hazael will become king. He's just not king yet. We're going to get there. But Ben-Hadad is going to be the main opposition here. He's the king of Aram. Again, this is the area of Syria, north of Israel. Very powerful nation, oftentimes clashing with Israel. This is not an unusual thing. It's one of the enemies that Israel has throughout their time. Not really a surprise there. But Ben-Hadad raises an army to invade Israel. Now, it talks about 32 other kings that joined him in his forces. I do not suppose that these are like great imperial, powerful kings. These are probably like city-state kings. They had some sort of sovereignty, but they were allied or somewhat submissive to Ben-Hadad. So I don't get the idea like these are like 32, or maybe 33, I guess, if you count Aram. 33 huge nations, just like overwhelming. They're probably just city-states. I don't imagine it's huge. But Aram itself would be enough of a challenge for Israel. So this is just like bonus soldiers for Ben-Hadad here. It also talks about he has horses and he's got chariots. These are the strongest weapons of war at the time. They're fast, they're powerful, they can move around on open plains. I mean, you don't want to be facing a chariot head on if you're just some guy with a stick. You're not going to do very well. So you got to be careful. The chariots are kind of like the tanks of the time. Very powerful. So we have this mighty army, large, additional forces in addition to the Arameans. You have these chariots, you have these horses, and Ben-Hadad seems to cross into Israel without much resistance because it just says, suddenly he goes to Samaria and besieges it. Well, Samaria is not on the border anywhere close to Aram. He would have had to come significantly far south to get there. So either the forces of Israel were not prepared and just never got themselves together to fight, or maybe there was some fighting, but they were easily crushed. We get absolutely no detail about it, but he has gone pretty much over halfway through the nation of Israel to get there. This is not some small incursion. He's probably invaded at least half the country just to get to Samaria. Otherwise, I don't know how he gets there. I guess he could have crossed the Jordan from some way, but that doesn't really make sense. But he's gone a long way to get to Samaria. So whatever battles have happened or not happened, we're not given details of. But this is not just some border city that he's laying siege to. He's laying siege to the capital of Israel sort of instantly, it seems. So he sends a group of messengers, and I think there's like 3 waves here, to Ahab. The first group demands that Ahab turn over his riches, his wives, his children. Basically, this is a humiliation to Ahab, but like, hey, if you submit to me and you give me these really great things, maybe I'll let you live kind of thing, but you'll kind of be my vassal or you'll be in submission to me, but at least you won't be dead. And Ahab is okay with this. I assume Ahab sees the numbers that he's facing, is like, yeah, we're not getting out of this one alive. We'll cut our losses. We'll do what he says. This is all he's demanding. We can do this. We'll carry on somehow. So that seems to be his reaction to it. But then he sends a second group of messengers, and they tell Ahab that Ben-Hadad's officials, they're going to go through your house. They're going to see everything that's of any value or anything, and they're just going to seize it, and they're going to take it away. Now, this seems, for whatever reason, this crosses the line. That's a very weird line that he's willing to give up his wives and his children, but as soon as they want to come in and take his stuff themselves, he's like, no, we're not doing that. But this would be an even bigger humiliation, to allow the enemy to just send people in to just confiscate all your stuff, kind of like a repo man. They're just going to come and they're going to take your things, and this is ours now. This would be a huge humiliation to Ahab. And Ahab, to his credit, he does consult some elders of Israel about this, and they say, no, you need to refuse this. This is over the line. This is beyond ridiculous. We were already submitting to him. You already had agreed to his terms. Now he's made the situation worse. For all of you Star Wars fans out there, I think of Vader and Lando. And Lando says, hey, you said this was going to be our deal. And he says, I'm altering the deal. Pray I do not alter it any further. That's exactly the kind of scene I get in my head. So, the kind of guy Ben-Hadad is. And then, so Ahab refuses them. So they go back and they tell Ben-Hadad, hey, he's not okay with this. He's not going to allow this. And we get kind of this, whole thing about that. And Ben-Hadad sends his third group of messengers to Ahab. Basically, he talks about, far be it from me if there's enough dust left in Samaria to give to each of my soldiers. Basically, he's saying, I'm about to come out, I'm about to destroy everything you've got. And clearly, he's got the power to do it. He's not saying it. It's not an empty threat, if you will. And Ahab's response is probably the most interesting. He says, the one who is putting his armor on should not be the one that's talking like the one who takes his armor off. And there are a couple different ways you can look at this. When you go into battle, you put your armor on, but you're not going to be, having the victory parades until that battle's done. You can take the armor off. So it's kind of like don't count your chickens before they hatch kind of thing, or just try me kind of thing. Or the Spartans had a great response to when they were threatened during one conflict. If we breach your walls, we're gonna take your children and everything you have. And they responded with if. It's a great response. And in a way, you could also see this as, if you're the one putting the armor on, you may not be the one taking that armor off when this battle is done either. So Ahab has got some nice fighting words there for Ben-Hadad. But of course, Ben-Hadad is not really happy about this. And so he's saying, okay, let's go to battle. He's drinking. They're having a great time. He may not be thinking very straight about what he's doing. It's maybe implied that. We might talk about that a little later as this chapter goes on. But that's where we are. We're out of time. So unless there are any final comments, questions, we're gonna stop there, and we'll continue the story on. It's a pretty good one. Okay, no comments. All right, we're going to stop there. We'll move on to verse 13 of chapter 20 next week. Thank you.